Now it's time for The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And you just made the day of every Hollywood screenwriter who is dreaming of someday getting the assignment for the miniseries of the Robert Mueller investigation. That there will come a day when the Manhattan Madam has to walk on to the set in the drama as it unfolds.
See, you just got my hopes up because you just suggested that it's possible that someday this will all be boiled downable into a miniseries. I feel like at this point it's an unabridged
100 episodes. Yeah. Maybe like a 100-episode miniseries. Yes, it'll be the new definition of miniseries.
That's what it feels like right now. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, it wasn't always this way. Political parties in Congress did not spend their every waking moment in lockstep with the president of their own political party. There has always been significant dissent in Congress within the party of the current president, until now. And last night, we heard how Republicans speak privately about what they need to do to protect their president. The Rachel Maddow Show obtained secret audio recordings of Congressman Devin Nunes at a Republican fundraiser for Congresswoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers, and they both made it very clear that they do not care what high crimes and misdemeanors Robert Mueller might discover the president committed, if any. They are going to protect the president no matter what. They believe that is their only job in dealing with the investigation of this president. First of all, try to stop the investigation. Secondly, if they cannot stop the investigation, make sure nothing happens to the president as a result of that investigation. And in order to do that, they need to win the congressional elections in November and preserve their majority. And here is the way Devin Nunes said that on that secretly recorded audio.
So therein lies, so it's like your classic catch-22 situation. Where, I mean, we're at this what puts us in such a tough spot. If Sessions won't unrecuse and Mueller won't clear the president, we're the only ones, which is really the danger. That's why I keep, and thank you for saying it, by the way. I mean, we have to keep all these secrets. We have to keep the majority. If we do not keep the majority, all of this goes away.
We're the only ones. The only ones who can save the president. The reason a special prosecutor was appointed to investigate President Bill Clinton was not that Republicans demanded it or that some newspaper editorials and some columnists demanded it. Bill Clinton and his Attorney General Janet Reno would have resisted those demands from Republicans. A special prosecutor was appointed because Democrats demanded it. Enough Democrats in the House and the Senate, including liberal Democrats and moderate Democrats, agreed that there should be a special prosecutor to investigate Bill and Hillary Clinton's financial dealings while he was governor of Arkansas. And eventually, Bill Clinton agreed. And President Clinton asked his Attorney General, Janet Reno, to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate him. That is how we got the last special prosecutor to investigate a Democratic president. When Richard Nixon was being investigated by a special prosecutor and by Congress, it was a bipartisan investigation in Congress. And although most Republicans tried to look at the mounting evidence against President Nixon as favorably as possible to President Nixon, none of them ever tried to say anything like this.
Just remember, what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening.
Republicans did not try to deny reality during the investigation of Richard Nixon. And eventually it was a group of Republican senators who went to the White House to tell President Nixon to his face that he should resign immediately because the House of Representatives would definitely vote to impeach him based on the latest evidence, and the United States Senate would easily reach a two-thirds majority vote to convict and remove President Nixon from office in an impeachment trial. And so on this very day, 44 years ago, President Nixon climbed into the helicopter on the White House lawn and waved goodbye to the White House staff for the final time. Richard Nixon was able to win the presidency in 1968 because the Democratic Party broke into open revolt in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives against their Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who was so shocked and politically crippled when his reelection was challenged in Democratic primaries, first by Senator Eugene McCarthy and then by Senator Robert Kennedy, that Lyndon Johnson surrendered to the insurrection in his party and announced he would not run for reelection. Democrat Lyndon Johnson gave up his own campaign for reelection to the presidency because of dissent within his own party over the Vietnam War. And so, no, it wasn't always this way. There was no democratically controlled Congress or Republican-controlled Congress in which there was absolutely no dissent, no resistance to the president of the same party who controlled that Congress. Not until now. What we are seeing with Devin Nunes and Catherine McMorris Rodgers and every Republican in the House and the Senate who is running for re-election is a total and complete violation of their oaths of office to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Instead, they behave and they speak as if they have taken an oath to defend Donald Trump, even if he is proven to be an enemy of the Constitution. We're the only ones. That's what you heard Devin Nunes say. If Sessions won't unrecuse and Mueller won't clear the president, we're the only ones. So what they're saying there is if the Attorney General of the United States abides by his oath to defend the Constitution, and if the Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller abides by his oath to defend the Constitution, then it will be up to them, the Republican members of Congress, to defend Donald Trump against the defenders of the Constitution. 44 years ago today, Richard Nixon left the White House for the last time because there was no Devin Nunes in the House of Representatives telling all the other Republicans we're the only ones who can save their president. It wasn't always this way. If the Republicans who served in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate when Richard Nixon was president were still serving today, we would not have to fear that we are living with a Congress that refuses to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Leading off our discussion now, Joyce Vance, former federal prosecutor. She's a professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Jonathan Capehart, he's opinion writer for the Washington Post. They are both MSNBC contributors. And Joyce, I want to get your reaction to what we heard on those secretly recorded audio recordings at that fundraiser from Devin Nunes, including this notion that basically, if the Attorney General does his job, if Robert Mueller does his job, then we are the only ones who can save this president.
It's pretty remarkable, Lawrence. What I hear Nunes saying is if the Attorney General upholds the rule of law, and if Rod Rosenstein and Robert Mueller uphold the rule of law, then it'll be up to us in the Congress to violate the rule of law and to put an end, in essence, to obstruct this investigation from coming to an ending point.
And Jonathan Capehart, there's much more that was said that Rachel and I played last night in that meeting. But being able to hear the way Republicans talk in private is a very special opportunity, as these tapes demonstrate.
Yeah, this is a situation where things that we sort of understood intuitively, things that we know just by watching the actions that they're not taking, we get to hear them say with words what it is that they are actually doing. That, as you said so eloquently at the top of this show, they are putting the livelihood of the presidency, their own standing, because they're all living in fear of the popularity of the president within the Republican Party, It is all about protecting Donald Trump. I don't even want to say it's about protecting the presidency. It's about protecting this man who has a 90-something% approval rating among those people who voted for him and an 88% approval rating within the Republican Party. They live in fear of him. And one other thing, Cathy McMorris Rodgers, who's the person that this fundraiser was for, the reason why David Nunes was up there, she barely eked out the top spot in her primary on Tuesday. And so if the number 4 ranked person in the Republican Party in the House of Representatives is having a hard time eking out the top spot in her reelection, what should that say to her? It should say to her that the people in her district, they see what she's doing, they know what she's doing, and they don't like what she's doing. And so she'll be fighting for her political life in November.
Joyce Vance, you're someone who's taken an oath of office as a U.S. attorney to serve in this government. And as you know, there are tens of thousands of people in Washington, working in Washington, in the Congress, in the agencies, in the departments, who have taken an oath of office. And I know it can sound naive to people out there who have either never taken that oath or don't know people who have. And Washington can seem like a purely political place. But every once in a while, when people would ask me about how things would work in the Senate, I would find myself saying, when they were getting overly cynical about certain things, and it's hard to get more cynical than I am, I would find myself saying every once in a while that, well, even the most political of them, every once in a while, they do come up against that oath. Because the oath, it was, when I was there, certainly taken seriously. It still moves me to say or read the words of that oath tonight in talking about it. And so I just wonder if you share my stunned amazement at the way those oaths seem to be completely disregarded by Devin Nunes and what he had to say.
It's almost as though the words have no meaning to them. In my office in Birmingham, Lawrence, when brand new prosecutors like me, I was a career prosecutor before I was the U.S. attorney. And when you took your oath of office, it was special. We all went over to the courthouse and one of the federal judges swore you in front of all of your new colleagues, but also in front of your family, your parents and your spouse and your children would come. And we would meet each other's families, and it was an incredibly solemn moment. And I think it sounds a little bit sappy. DOJ prosecutors don't usually talk about it outside of their offices, but people take that oath incredibly seriously. And you will find that people, when they're confronting difficult issues, will use that as a touchstone to think, what's the right thing to do? Because tomorrow I'll stand up in court and say, I represent the United States of America. Same thing for people in the House, elected officials on the Hill. They stand up every day to represent the people of the United States of America. Some of them don't seem to take that very seriously.
Yeah, and I have to say, I didn't know when I started working in the Senate that I had to take an oath, the same oath that the senators take. Everybody working there does, the receptionists, everyone. And so I was thrown into it without any real preparation that it was suddenly happening. My right hand was raised, and it was instantly an emotional moment. You never forget it. Jonathan Capehart, new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. How likely are you to vote for a candidate who promises to provide a check on Donald Trump? More likely, 48%. Less likely, 23%. That is just an enormous gap in favor of what obviously is the Democrats in the way that question's asked.
Right. And that gets to what I was saying, I guess, preemptively about Cathy McMorris Rodgers. She's not providing a check on the president. And so she barely made the top spot. In Washington State, they have the so-called jungle primary. So the top 2 vote getters go on to November. She's the number 4 person in the Republican conference. And now she might not be there. If that holds out, if that poll number holds out to be true, she could be out. Back during Watergate, back during the Clinton era, when Congress viewed itself as an equal to the executive, an equal to the president. The president was one branch, they, the members of Congress, viewed themselves as someone who were supposed to, no matter the party, keep the executive in check, because the framers of the Constitution set this government up so that the people, through their representatives, could ensure that the executive would not run roughshod over the people and over the Constitution. And the Republicans have shown time and time again, particularly when it comes to Donald Trump, that they couldn't care less about their oath of office. That oath, I've never had to take that oath, Lawrence, but I have friends who have. And the thing that makes it so emotional for you and for Joyce and for my friends who've taken that oath is that they suddenly realize that they are making an oath to something that is much bigger than themselves. They are taking an oath to protect not just the Constitution, but their country, but their families. And the fact that you have a whole branch of government that has just ceded that authority, that moral authority, to a president who has shown time and again that he couldn't care less about the rule of law, it's galling. And through that number that you just showed, 48% of the American people think it's galling as well.
Jonathan Capehart, Joyce Vance, thank you for starting us off tonight.
Thanks, Lawrence.
And now that Republican Congressman Chris Collins and his son have been charged with federal crimes, which one of them might get a plea deal to escape prison time in exchange for testifying against the other? And what is it like for Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. watching the Collins father and son being dragged into federal court yesterday? And up next, New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Tom Friedman, who can be very persuasive, will try to change my mind about televising Trump rallies from start to finish. The most common complaint by far that I have heard about cable TV news for the last 3 years now is that allowing Donald Trump rallies to go out live to viewers from beginning to end is delivering a poison to the bloodstream of the nation. And I've always agreed with that criticism, but now I'm not so sure. And once again, it is New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman who has gotten me to think about maybe changing my mind. And I say once again because Thomas Friedman is one of the modern masters of counterintuitive thought that can actually shake my firmly held opinions. In his latest column, Thomas Friedman says that televising Donald Trump's rallies is the right thing for the news media to do professionally and, quote, it is the right thing to do politically if you want to see a check on Donald Trump's power. It appears that it's the toxic lying, bullying, and unpresidential behaviors that Trump exhibits most in his rallies and tweets, which we in the media so incessantly cover, that is turning off the very moderate, best-educated Republicans and suburban women that Trump will need to hold the GOP majority in the House, let alone get reelected. So bring on the coverage. Tom Friedman makes the point that even with a strong economy, Donald Trump's approval has not increased since he was elected. He has not converted any of the voters that did not vote for him. Tom Friedman writes, the very applause lines and abusive and divisive behaviors that appeal to his base turn off more moderate and more educated suburban Republicans and do nothing to attract independents or conservative Democrats. Tom Friedman's conclusion for the news media is, quote, I want wall-to-wall coverage of Trump's every speech, rally, tweet, and utterance because they most reveal his character, and Trump's character is the ceiling on Trump's presidency. And joining our discussion now is Thomas Friedman, New York Times foreign affairs columnist, Pulitzer Prize winner, and the author of the best-selling book. Thank you for being late. And Tom, I believe you began this segment with this audience with approximately zero agreement to your position, but maybe some of what I just quoted is pulling people in your way. And I have to say, your column really unmoored me. You make a very strong case.
Well, I appreciate it, Lawrence, and it was a surprise to me because I watched the Senate election in Alabama where Jones, the Democrat, won coming out of nowhere. You watched the by-election in Pennsylvania. You watched the one in Ohio, and the one in Ohio was most striking because this was a district that had not sent a Democrat to Congress in over 3 decades. It's a district that Trump won by 11 percentage points, and the Republican candidate, Balderson, seems to be winning by at the most 1. So something clearly is going on here that has eroded Trump's base. And I often start, Lawrence, by interviewing myself. And what do I feel? And what I feel is when I watch these rallies, when I see these tweets, I feel appalled. I feel appalled as an American by the divisiveness, by the toxicity. I feel ashamed to see a president attacking such a high-quality American sports stars, LeBron James, after he's opened a school for 400 impoverished kids. And I think this is, it turns out, Lawrence, that there are moderate Republicans out there. There are independents. There are clearly suburban women who are deeply turned off by this. And they voted with their feet. They voted with by pulling levers. It's showing up in the polls. They've kept a lid on Trump's support. And I think if we deny them, this sort of the access to the president, the full Trump, I think we're not doing our jobs professionally, but also as someone who believes it is essential that there be a check on Trump's power for the last 2 years of his presidency, at a minimum, Democratic control of the House. I think it'd be a mistake politically.
Now, you make the point in your column, something that I heard Mike Murphy say last week, I think possibly in a tweet, that the way to cover the rally is to just set up one camera for all of the networks to get the feed from that one camera. Do not send reporters into that pen, that cage that the Trump campaign and now the Trump presidency sets up, a cage for reporters where they're not allowed to even talk to any of the members of the audience. So there's no reporting function for them to do there. Set up the camera. We all get the video. My version of that is set up the camera, we all get the video, and I will show you if the president says anything worth showing to you, which might be something grotesque or might be something newsworthy. Your argument is no, let it run. Let people see every bit of it.
I think there's... I think Trump's a disturbed person. I think there's something deeply disturbing about these rallies. I find it appalling. People reportedly, showing up in a T-shirt saying, I prefer Russians over Democrats. These are deeply aberrant behaviors. And I think that there are many thinking Republicans who are telling us by how they voted. I interviewed in that column Stanley Greenberg, the veteran pollster, who has been running focus groups with Republicans. And this is exactly what he's found, that moderate Republicans are turned off by it. Some, more diehard ones, about half of them are. And that even evangelicals, it all reminds them of the Faustian bargain they've made in supporting Donald Trump. And while they're not abandoning him, this is not redounding to his favor.
There's the Sacha Baron Cohen's new show on Showtime. He opens it with these clips, impressive clips of former presidents of the United States saying some of their most famous lines. And then he includes this moment, which we're going to show now, of Donald Trump mimicking Steve Kovaleski. This is Donald Trump's entry in that line of presidential comment. Let's listen to this.
I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
And Tom, it is absolutely repulsive every time. It is shocking when it comes at the flow in Sacha Baron Cohen's show, at the end of a flow that includes JFK and FDR. And your point is, the more the public sees of that, the worse it is for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that the biggest lid on President Trump is the character of Donald Trump. And I think this really matters to people. And also, one of the things that's, we've talked about this a little before, Lawrence, the thing you have to remember with Trump, too, is that we haven't had a crisis yet. There's been no, thank God, no 9/11, no 2008. But, crises can come. And one thing we know about Trump is that when a crisis comes, he blames others. He doesn't take responsibility. And so, all of this is part of the man's character. And I think we've been exposed to it now in isolation from Hillary Clinton. In the election 2 years ago, people said, well, I'm going to plug my nose and vote for the guy of bad character because I can't vote for Hillary Clinton. I think she is a bad character. That was enough to pull enough moderate Republicans over the line to just get Donald Trump to squeak through. But now we've had 2 years of the full Trump. And I think a lot of people understand that this is a personality and this is a person who needs to be checked. I don't know if there'll be enough. It depends, obviously, on the Democratic candidate in every district, in every state, and ultimately having a leader of the Democratic Party. You can't beat something with nothing. And, that will have to come down the road. But I think character matters, and this is another thing I believe, and maybe it's just the Minnesota nice Midwestern boy in me, but I think Americans really want to be pulled together. I don't think they like being divided like Sunnis and Shiites. And I don't say all of them, but I think there's a constituency there. And when you think of how narrowly Trump won some of these Midwestern states, boy, it doesn't take a lot of Republicans to stay home, just to stay home, let alone vote for a Democrat, to tip the next presidential election and maybe a lot of these districts.
Tom Friedman, the column is must read as always. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up, today is the 4th anniversary of the killing of Michael Brown, the unarmed 18-year-old who was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. One of the people who was protesting that killing at that time has just won the election for district attorney in Ferguson. We will also have more on the insider trading case of Congressman Collins and his son. Crime is sometimes a father and son game in the mafia and sometimes in the Republican Party. Republican Congressman Chris Collins was charged with insider trading yesterday and lying to the FBI, along with his 25-year-old son, Cameron Collins, who was charged with exactly the same crimes. In this case, crime was not just a father and son game. It was a father and son's wife, and son's father-in-law, and son's other friends. Reports indicate that President Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, was facing the possibility of being charged with crimes along with his son, Michael Flynn Jr., when Michael Flynn reached a plea deal with Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. Michael Flynn pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI, and his son, Michael Flynn Jr., was not charged with any crimes. Watching a couple of years now of this Republican father and son very mini crime spree from their front row seats are Donald Trump Jr. and Donald Trump. What Donald Trump Jr. can be sure of is that Donald Trump is no Michael Flynn. Donald Trump has never put his children first or anyone else first. There is no chance of Donald Trump volunteering to take the hit in a criminal investigation in order to save his son or his daughter or his son-in-law or anyone else. Chris Collins finds himself in a very different situation than Michael Flynn did. Congressman Collins' son is already now charged with crimes, and so it is a lot less clear that Congressman Collins can get his son off the hook by taking the hit and pleading guilty the way Michael Flynn did. Congressman Collins is the big fish in this investigation. His son, Cameron Collins, is the little fish. So what Congressman Collins has to wonder is, how long will it take for his son to turn against him? How long will it take for Congressman Collins' son to plead guilty in exchange for no prison time and testify against his father? And that is the drama that President Trump will watch most closely. How long does it take for the son to turn against the father? Joining our discussion now, David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who founded DCReport.org. He is the author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And back with us, Joyce Vance, former federal prosecutor. David, what do you suppose is going through the Trump minds as they watch the Collins case unfold?
Oh, thank goodness Daddy has the power of the pardon.
Yes.
Probably is their first thought, which Chris Collins does not have. And I've been talking tonight to both Republicans and Democrats and business people up here in Western New York, where I live. And it is astonishing to hear how on both sides people really dislike Chris Collins and feel like he's getting his just desserts in this indictment.
And Joyce Vance, when I look at the Collins case, the father, the congressman, is the big fish. The son, it seems to me, is the place where the prosecutors would go and be willing, possibly, to make a deal for the son to testify against the father, then putting even more pressure on the father to possibly testify or reveal something about his relationship with the 5 other Republican members of Congress who he got to invest in this stock that he was charged with insider trading.
Yeah, you know, a lot of open questions on this one. You would expect prosecutors to have typically approached Collins and his son pre-indictment to see if they could work a deal at that stage. So seeing them both together in this indictment possibly is a signal that Collins wasn't willing to cooperate, at least not pre-indictment, to spare his son from being indicted and going through this charging process. It's a little bit difficult to know what to make about Collins' possibility as a witness against other Congresspeople. He looks like more of the big fish in this one to me than they do. And typically you don't see a big fish testifying against lesser participants in a conspiracy. But again, we don't know how everything stacks up here, and we don't know who else Collins might be able to offer testimony against. So a lot of shoes left to drop off the centipede in this one.
And David, up there in upstate New York, in the western part of the state near Buffalo, where you live in the Rochester area, part of the same area, Chris Collins now running for re-election, just running for re-election. And his statement last night was, I will not answer any questions about this case between now and election night. And so how's that going to work in the campaign?
Well, prior to the indictment, even with all the bad local publicity he's gotten, he was probably a shoo-in, but he may now be in jeopardy because of this. And I think there's quickly spreading awareness that he was the largest shareholder in this Australian company. He and his family owned over 20% of all the shares that he was touting to other members of Congress. And one of the things I expect his Democratic opponent, who is the manager of a suburban island, actually called Grand Island, to hammer him on is that members of Congress shouldn't be investors in individual stocks, and they certainly shouldn't be the largest single shareholder in a company. They should only have to be able to own, mutual funds and things like that.
Yeah, David, this is one of those stories where one of the big parts of the scandal is what was legal. He could be on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, on the subcommittee with jurisdiction over some healthcare issues where he's heavily invested in a healthcare company.
And we've had other members of Congress in the past who are known to have, with their cell phones, issued orders for trades while they're in hearings about legislation in front of them. And that this has not been stopped is one of the biggest changes we need. We need to make sure that members of Congress, just like we would expect of the president, represent the people in their district and America, not their personal, financial, and venal interests.
David Cay Johnston and Joyce Vance, thank you both for joining us tonight. 4 years ago, protesters in Ferguson, Missouri were demanding the district attorney be removed from the investigation of the police killing of Michael Brown. Tuesday night, the district attorney was removed from his job, in effect, when one of the people who was with those protesters 4 years ago defeated the district attorney in his re-election campaign. Wesley Bell, who will be the next district attorney in Ferguson, Missouri, will be our next guest. On this very day, August 9th, exactly 4 years ago, at 12:01 p.m., 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot 6 times and killed by a Ferguson, Missouri police officer. Michael Brown was unarmed and at least 100 feet away from the police officer and incapable of harming the police officer when the officer began firing at Michael Brown. As the bullets hit Michael Brown, rendering him completely helpless, the officer decided to continue to fire. Michael Brown was hit with 6 bullets, including 1 in the head, to stop what was obviously a non-existent threat, especially after the first bullet hit Michael Brown. Ferguson, Missouri police left Michael Brown's body on the street where he fell for 4 hours on this day 4 years ago, and the people of Ferguson rose up in protest. It was the kind of protest we had seen many, many times before in this country, including when Arthur McDuffie was killed by police in 1979 in Miami. But the protests we saw in Ferguson, Missouri, combined with the police reaction to those protests, turned into the first rioting over police use of deadly force that occurred since the invention of cable news and the internet and social media. There was no cable news to cover the rioting in Miami in 1980 after the Arthur McDuffie case, or many of the other cases that occurred in those days. And so the McDuffie case remained a mostly local story. America did not wake up then to the problems associated with police use of deadly force. But 4 years ago, the cable news media immediately descended on Ferguson, where our correspondents and others were reporting live from the streets every day and night of the unrest. And Barack Obama became the first president of the United States to publicly discuss police use of deadly force and acknowledged that abuse of that police power to kill is a problem. It took the killing of Michael Brown and the rioting that followed to finally get all of America to pay attention to police use of deadly force. Sadly, nothing gets America's attention quite like a riot. It took the killing of Michael Brown and the community's reaction to it to get the Attorney General of the United States, for the first time in history, to respond directly to protests about a killing by police and actually go to that community and listen to their concerns. When Attorney General Eric Holder went to Ferguson, he met Wesley Bell, who was then a law professor. Wesley Bell joined us on this program on that day that he met Attorney General Eric Holder in Ferguson. He joined us by phone during our live coverage of the protests that were occurring that night. One of the targets of the protesters was District Attorney Bob McCullough, who was guiding a grand jury through a process that would eventually lead to no charges being filed against the officer who shot and killed the unarmed Michael Brown. I asked Wesley Bell then about public comments District Attorney McCullough had been making that sounded biased to the protesters. This is what he told us about District Attorney McCullough that night.
What I do know is that our elected leaders need to set a precedent or a tone of confidence so the public feels confident and that justice is being served. And I think that, again, I don't know Mr. McCullough personally, but my one constructive criticism would be that the comments that are coming out of the office aren't inspiring. They aren't encouraging. They seem to be something other than transparency. And I think that if he was to ask my advice, which he is not, I would say understand that the world is watching, that Ferguson, North County, and St. Louis are watching, and let us feel that this situation is being handled transparently.
Protesters were then calling for District Attorney McCullough to be removed from the investigation of the Michael Brown case. On Tuesday night, Wesley Bell removed Bob McCullough from his job, in effect, as district attorney by winning the Democratic primary for district attorney. No Republican is running for the job, so in November, Wesley Bell will no doubt officially be elected the next district attorney with jurisdiction over Ferguson, Missouri. Wesley Bell joins us next.
This was the definition and exemplification of a grassroots campaign.
That video was recorded Tuesday night by ABC 7 Missouri when Wesley Bell beat Bob McCullough in the race for St. Louis County District Attorney. And Wesley Bell joins us now. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. You ran, one of the things you ran on your platform was appointing special prosecutors for police-involved shootings. That obviously is an echo of the Michael Brown case. So how much was the Michael Brown case a factor in your win?
I don't think anyone can deny the fact that Ferguson brought to light the need to address issues like criminal justice reform, the need to address issues of mass incarceration. People became more aware as a result of Ferguson. So I don't know what the exact contribution would be as far as numbers or what have you, but I know when I talked to voters across St. Louis County, many were very aware of these issues, and I'm sure it played some part.
It was an overwhelming victory. You got 56% of the vote against the incumbent McCullough's 43% of the vote. That is just a wipeout. Was that the way it was feeling to you as Election Day was approaching?
I tell you what, all indications told us that we were going to win, and we were going to win big. The only hesitancy was, man, this is a 27-year incumbent, so I don't want to get too confident. But I mean, we were knocking on doors. We were seeing the support coming from all over St. Louis County, and people were enthused. Even on the polls, when I sat on polls, and people would come up to me, and I would try to introduce myself, and they, so many people would be like, "Wait, I know who you are. I came to vote for you." And so it was a very uplifting, and it was just it was a great evening, obviously, for us.
When did you decide to run?
I had forgotten that I had done that interview with you, and so I can say after I ran for city council, I started to at least think about that office, because I had worked as a public defender and as a defense attorney, and even as a municipal court prosecutor. I've worked against and with that office, and I've always disagreed with the practices and policies, and I always thought to myself that I could never work in that office. I'd have to run it. And so after I was elected, now it's an empowering feeling and so now your mind wanders and you think, okay, well, maybe I could do this. And I know around that time of that interview, the seeds were being planted, if you will.
You and I have something in common. We're both the sons of police officers, and I'm wondering how that affects your approach to policing police.
Well, first of all, I have to say retired police officer. My dad reminds me of that every single time I talk to him. But, what it's instilled in me is a respect for law enforcement. I know that that's one of the toughest jobs in the world. At the same time, though, just like everyone watching this show is accountable for their actions, if officers break the law, they have to be accountable as well. Now, having said that, if there's an officer-involved shooting, God forbid, and the officer did everything correctly, then we're going to support that officer 200%. But if the officer violated the law, then the officer, again, needs to be held accountable, just like anyone watching would be held accountable for their actions.
Wesley Bell, congratulations on the big win, and thank you very much for joining The Last Word again tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll be right back. And we have new numbers tonight in the vote count in the 12th congressional district in Ohio, where Republican Troy Balderson currently leads Democrat Danny O'Connor. Ohio election officials say that they found 588 previously uncounted votes in a suburb of Columbus today. The majority of those votes were for Democrat Danny O'Connor. So Troy Balderson's lead in the count now is 1,564 votes. That is a drop of about 190 votes in his lead. There are outstanding absentee ballots and provisional ballots by the thousands still left. There's approximately 8,000 of those still left. And so we will not have a winner. We will not have a concession by a loser in this race until all of those votes are counted by August 18th.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes from MSNBC. You know, every day I come to the office and we make a television show. And every day I think to myself, there's so much more I want to talk about. And so this is our podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening? And the whole idea behind it is to get to the root of the things that we see play out every day. They're driven by big ideas. Each week, I sit down with a person uniquely suited to explain why this is happening.
New episodes of Why Is This Happening? Every Tuesday. Listen for free wherever you get your podcasts.